June 6, 1944, 10:15 in the morning. Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. The sound is silence. Not the peaceful silence of the Bavarian Alps on a summer morning, but the tense, suffocating silence of a room full of men who are afraid to speak. Adolf Hitler sits behind his massive oak desk, his hands trembling slightly as he reads the latest intelligence summary from Normandy. His face is pale, his eyes sunken from another night of insomnia and amphetamines. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminates dust motes in the air and catches the edge of the paper shaking in his hands. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel stands at attention 3 paces from the desk, his own face carefully neutral. He has just delivered the morning briefing on the invasion, now 5 hours old. The news is bad, worse than bad. It is catastrophic in ways that Keitel is still struggling to fully comprehend, but it is one specific piece of information buried in the mass of reports from the coast that has caused Hitler to go silent. The Canadians at Juno Beach have broken through the Atlantic Wall, not just penetrated it, not just established a toehold. They have broken completely through the coastal defenses and are now advancing inland faster than any other Allied formation. And they did it, according to the preliminary German reports, in approximately 37 minutes from landing to breakthrough. Hitler looks up from the paper. His eyes, which can shift from distant vacancy to burning intensity in an instant, focus on Keitel. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, dangerously quiet. "Explain to me," Hitler says slowly, "how Canadian farmers broke through fortifications that took 3 years to build. Explain it to me now." Keitel, a man who has survived years in Hitler's inner circle by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, chooses his words carefully. "Mein Führer, the initial reports suggest that the defenders at Juno Beach were overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the assault. The 716 Infantry Division," Hitler cuts him off. "The 716 Division is German. The attackers are Canadians. How does a German division, dug into concrete bunkers with machine guns and artillery, lose to Canadians in 37 minutes? The question hangs in the air. Because Hitler is not asking for tactical details. He is asking something more fundamental. He is asking how his ideology, his entire worldview, can be reconciled with what just happened on the coast of France. And Keitel, who is a professional soldier and not a Nazi ideologue, knows that there is no answer that will satisfy the Führer. Because the answer is simple and unacceptable. The Canadians are better soldiers than Hitler believes possible. This is not a story about a single battle or a single breakthrough. This is a story about what happens when a leader's delusions collide with reality. About how Hitler's refusal to accurately assess Allied capabilities, specifically Canadian capabilities, contributed to Germany's defeat in Normandy. And about what Hitler said and did when confronted with evidence that his racial ideology was not just morally wrong, but strategically catastrophic. Because Hitler did say something about the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach. Multiple things, in fact, over the hours and days that followed D-Day. And those statements, recorded by the men who were present and documented in the historical record, reveal a man whose grip on reality was already slipping and whose mistakes would cost Germany any chance of throwing the Allies back into the sea. To understand Hitler's reaction to Juno Beach, you must understand what he believed about Canada and Canadians. In Hitler's racial hierarchy, carefully constructed over decades of twisted reasoning, the world was divided into superior and inferior peoples. Germans occupied the highest tier. Other Nordic peoples, including the British, were grudgingly acknowledged as racial cousins. Americans were a mixed bag, polluted by immigration, but possessing industrial power that demanded respect. But Canadians? In Hitler's mind, Canadians barely existed. Canada was not a nation in any meaningful sense. It was a colonial territory, a frozen wilderness populated by British farmers and French peasants. The Canadian Army, when Hitler thought about it at all, was a joke. A small volunteer force with no military tradition, no industrial base, and no reason to exist except as a token contribution to the British Empire. Hitler's intelligence services knew better. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had compiled extensive reports on Canadian forces training in Britain. These reports noted that Canadian divisions were well-equipped, thoroughly trained, and showed high morale. German assessments of the Canadian Army were generally respectful, sometimes even concerned. But Hitler dismissed these reports, not because he had better information, but because the reports contradicted his ideology. In Hitler's worldview, a nation of farmers and trappers could not produce effective soldiers. The very idea was absurd. And so when the German High Command planned the defense of Normandy, when they positioned forces and allocated reserves, they did so based on Hitler's assumptions rather than accurate intelligence. The strongest German forces were positioned at Pas-de-Calais, where Hitler was certain the main invasion would come. Normandy was defended, but not with Germany's best divisions. And within Normandy, the sectors where Canadians were expected to land received even less priority. The 716 Infantry Division, defending Juno Beach and the surrounding area, was a static coastal defense unit. It was composed largely of older men, recovered wounded, and conscripts from occupied territories. These were not elite troops. They were garrison soldiers, adequate for manning bunkers and conducting routine patrols, but not prepared for intensive combat against determined assault forces. German planners assumed this would be sufficient because they assumed the Canadians would not be particularly effective attackers. They assumed wrong. When the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division hit Juno Beach at 07:45 on the morning of June 6th, they encountered all the obstacles and defenses that the Germans had prepared. Concrete bunkers housing 75mm and 88mm guns, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, beach obstacles designed to rip open landing craft, mines, and barbed wire. The Germans had done their job. The defenses were formidable. But the Canadians, trained specifically for this moment, hit those defenses with overwhelming aggression. They landed under fire, took casualties, kept moving. When their tanks got stuck on underwater obstacles, they pushed forward without armor support. When machine gun fire cut down entire sections, the survivors kept advancing. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in wire. They threw grenades into bunker firing slits. They fought with a ferocity that shocked the German defenders. And by 08:22, according to German unit reports later captured by Allied intelligence, Canadian forces had penetrated completely through the coastal defense zone and were advancing inland toward their first-day objectives. 37 minutes, from landing to breakthrough, not for a small raiding party, for an entire division. This was supposed to be impossible. German defensive doctrine assumed that assault forces would spend hours, possibly days, fighting through coastal defenses. The Atlantic Wall was designed to delay and attrit attackers, giving German mobile reserves time to arrive and counterattack. But the Canadians had blown through it so fast that German reserves were still organizing when the beachhead was already secured. And this was the information that reached Hitler's headquarters 5 hours later, distilled into a few lines in an intelligence summary. Canadian forces have achieved breakthrough at Juno Beach. Coastal defenses penetrated in approximately 30 to 40 minutes. Enemy forces advancing on Caen. It is clinical, factual, and absolutely devastating to Hitler's understanding of the war. Because if Canadians can do this, then everything Hitler believes about German superiority, about the invincibility of German defenses, about the racial hierarchy that justifies Nazi ideology, all of it is called into question. Hitler's first response, sitting behind his desk at Berghof, is denial. The reports are wrong, he says flatly. The Canadians did not break through. This is British forces using Canadian insignia as deception, or the defenders retreated without orders. Find out which unit commanded that sector and prepare courts-martial. Keitel, who has dealt with Hitler's denials before, tries a different approach. Mein Führer, multiple independent reports confirm Canadian presence at Juno Beach. Prisoners have been taken. Unit identifications are confirmed. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division is definitely the assault force. Hitler's face darkens. Then the 716 Division failed. They abandoned their positions, find the commanders and have them shot. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, speaks up carefully. Mein Führer, the 716 fought according to doctrine. They inflicted casualties on the attackers, but they were overwhelmed by superior force and aggressive tactics. Hitler turns his glare on Jodl. Superior force? The Canadians are not a superior force. They are colonials. They should not be capable of overwhelming German soldiers in fortified positions. Jodl, who unlike Keitel is willing to push back when military reality demands it, tries again. Mein Führer, the Canadian Army is well trained and well equipped. They have been preparing for this assault for years. We must not underestimate. Hitler slams his hand on the desk. The sudden violence makes both generals flinch. I do not underestimate. I assess correctly. Germany represents the pinnacle of military development. Our soldiers are superior. Our defenses are superior. If the line was broken, it is because of failure, not because of enemy capability. This is Hitler's fundamental problem. He cannot separate tactical reality from ideological necessity. If German soldiers lost to Canadian soldiers, then either the German soldiers failed in their duty, or they were betrayed, or the reports are wrong. But the possibility that the Canadians simply fought better, that they executed a superior assault with better tactics and better leadership, that possibility does not exist in Hitler's mental framework. Over the next several hours, as more reports arrive from Normandy, Hitler's responses follow a predictable pattern. Each piece of bad news is either denied, minimized, or blamed on German failure, rather than Allied capability. When told that the Canadians have reached villages 3 kilometers inland by midday, Hitler insists this is a temporary penetration that will be contained by counterattacks. When told that the Canadians are threatening the critical road junction at Carpiquet, Hitler blames the local commanders for not organizing proper defense. When told that Canadian armor is moving rapidly inland, Hitler claims the tanks must be British or American because Canadian industry is not capable of producing effective tanks. His staff, accustomed to these outbursts, feed him information carefully. They learn not to emphasize Canadian successes. Instead, they frame everything in terms of German actions or failures. The defense at Juno Beach was inadequate instead of the Canadians attacked effectively. Our reserves are being delayed instead of Canadian forces are moving faster than anticipated. This linguistic contortion is necessary because direct statements about Allied capability send Hitler into rages that make productive military planning impossible. But the information keeps coming, and it keeps getting worse. By afternoon of June 6th, it is clear that the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach is the deepest Allied penetration of the day. The Canadians have advanced further inland than the British at Golden Sword beaches. They have advanced much further than the Americans at Omaha Beach, where casualties are catastrophic and progress is measured in yards. The Canadian 3rd Division, which Hitler has dismissed as colonial farmers, is now the greatest immediate threat to the German defensive position in Normandy. They are positioned to potentially cut off German forces and capture Caen, the critical road and rail junction that dominates the region. And the German reserves that could stop them, the panzer divisions that could throw them back, are sitting idle because Hitler has not released them for commitment, because Hitler still believes the Normandy landings are a diversion, he still believes the main assault will come at Pas-de-Calais, and he refuses to commit his mobile reserves to what he thinks is a secondary effort. This is one of the most consequential decisions of the war, and it is driven partly by Hitler's inability to take the Canadians seriously. If the breakthrough at Juno Beach had been reported as a British breakthrough, Hitler might have responded differently. If American forces had penetrated that deeply, he might have seen it as the threat it was. But because it is Canadians, because his ideology tells him that Canadians are not a serious military threat, he convinces himself that the situation is manageable. By evening of June 6th, Hitler has moved from denial to anger. He rages at his generals for the failure of the coastal defenses. He demands explanations for how the Atlantic Wall, which cost billions of Reichsmarks and 3 years of labor to build, was breached in under an hour. And he keeps returning to the Canadians. How, he shouts at his assembled staff, how did Canadians accomplish this? Nobody has an answer that will satisfy him, because the true answer, that the Canadians are professional soldiers who trained extensively and fought with skill and courage, is ideologically unacceptable. His staff tries different explanations, the element of surprise, naval bombardment, air support. Each explanation is partially true but incomplete, and each one prompts Hitler to find German failures to blame. Why didn't German radar detect the invasion fleet sooner? Why wasn't the Luftwaffe able to contest Allied air superiority? Why weren't beach obstacles more effective? These are legitimate questions, but Hitler uses them to avoid confronting the central truth. The Allies, including the Canadians, are simply better at amphibious warfare than Germany anticipated. Hitler spends the evening of June 6th issuing orders. Most of them are useless or counterproductive. He orders the 716 Division commander relieved and court-martialed, even though the man is probably dead or captured. He orders immediate counterattacks against the Juno beachhead, even though the forces to conduct such attacks are not available. He orders the Luftwaffe to launch maximum effort attacks against the invasion fleet, even though the Luftwaffe barely exists as an effective force anymore. And, critically, he refuses to release the panzer reserves. He is still convinced that Normandy is a feint. The real invasion, he insists, will come at Calais. The panzer divisions must be held back for the real battle. His generals, particularly Rommel and von Rundstedt, plead with him to release the armor. The window for an effective counterattack is closing. If panzers can hit the beachheads in the next 24 to 48 hours, while the Allies are still organizing and before they can bring their full strength ashore, there is a chance to drive them back into the sea. But if Germany waits, if the Allies are allowed to consolidate and expand their beachheads, the opportunity will be lost. Hitler refuses, and part of his refusal is driven by his continued underestimation of the Canadians. He cannot believe that a Canadian division represents the Schwerpunkt, the main point of effort of the Allied invasion. Therefore, their success must be temporary, an aberration, not something requiring the commitment of Germany's precious armored reserves. By June 7th, as the Canadians continue to expand their beachhead and push toward Caen, Hitler's position begins to shift. Not because he suddenly understands Canadian capabilities, but because the sheer weight of evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The Canadians are not being thrown back, they are not collapsing. They are, in fact, consolidating their positions and preparing to advance further. Hitler calls another conference. His chief of staff for the Western Theater, along with representatives from the units fighting in Normandy, brief him on the situation. When they reach the Juno Beach sector, Hitler interrupts. Why are the Canadians still advancing? Where are our counterattacks? The response is careful. Mein Führer, we have attempted local counterattacks. They have been repulsed. The Canadians have strong defensive positions and are supported by naval gunfire. To dislodge them, we need armored forces. Hitler's face twists. Armored forces against Canadians? We need our panzers to fight the British and Americans, not to waste effort on colonials. It is a revealing statement. Even now, even confronted with clear evidence of Canadian effectiveness, Hitler cannot bring himself to classify them as a serious threat. In his hierarchy of enemies, Americans and British require Germany's best forces. Canadians should be able to be handled by second-line troops. This attitude filters down through the German command structure. Units facing the Canadians receive lower priority for reinforcements and supplies. Counterattacks into the Canadian sector are planned with less care and fewer resources than counterattacks against British or American positions. And the Canadians, professional and aggressive, exploit every German mistake. They advance when the Germans expect them to consolidate. They attack when the Germans expect them to defend. They move at night when the Germans think darkness will halt operations. By June 8th, 2 days after the invasion, the Canadians have established a beachhead 6 miles deep and are threatening Carpiquet airfield, a key German position. And Hitler, receiving these reports, finally begins to acknowledge that something is wrong with his assessment. He does not admit that his ideology is flawed. He does not concede that the Canadians are effective soldiers, but he starts to question the quality of German forces facing them. The divisions in Normandy are weak, he tells his staff, second-rate units. That is why the Canadians are making progress. Against our elite divisions, they would fail. It is a face-saving explanation. Hitler can acknowledge that the Canadians are doing well without admitting that they are inherently capable. He simply redefines the German forces they are fighting as inadequate. This is classic Hitler. Twist reality to fit ideology rather than adjust ideology to match reality. But this explanation has an implication. If the Canadians are succeeding because they are fighting weak German divisions, then to stop them, Germany needs to commit strong divisions, which means Hitler must finally release his panzer reserves. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Hitler authorizes the movement of panzer divisions toward Normandy. But the authorization comes with conditions. The panzers are not to be thrown recklessly at the beachheads. They are to be held for a coordinated counteroffensive that will split the Allied lodgment and drive them back to the sea. This counteroffensive is scheduled for June 10th, then June 11th, then June 12th. Each delay allows the Allies to strengthen their positions, and each delay is partly due to Hitler's continued belief that the Normandy landings might still be a diversion. He cannot fully commit to defending Normandy because he cannot shake his certainty that the main blow will fall elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the Canadian sector, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division is joined by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade. The Canadian forces continue to fight aggressively, pushing toward Caen, engaging German armor and tying down forces that Germany desperately needs elsewhere. Hitler, receiving daily reports on Canadian operations, begins to obsess over them, not with respect, with resentment. He makes statements to his staff that reveal his thinking. The Canadians are fighting beyond their capability. They must be stiffened by British officers. Find out how many British battalions are mixed into Canadian formations. The answer, which his staff provides reluctantly, is none. The Canadian forces are entirely Canadian, commanded by Canadian officers, with Canadian doctrine and Canadian training. Hitler does not accept this. Then they are being directly controlled by British headquarters. The Canadians themselves are not capable of independent operations at this scale. Again, the answer is no. The Canadian divisions are operating with considerable autonomy under their own corps headquarters. Hitler's frustration grows, because every day the evidence mounts that his assessment of Canadian capabilities was wrong, and every day his refusal to adjust that assessment cost Germany time and opportunities. By mid-June, 2 weeks after D-Day, the situation in Normandy has stabilized into a grinding battle of attrition. The Allies hold a secure beachhead but have not yet achieved a breakthrough. The Germans have contained the invasion but have not driven it back into the sea. And in the Canadian sector, the fighting around Caen has become some of the most intense of the entire campaign. The Canadians are facing the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, elite troops composed of fanatical teenagers. The fighting is brutal. Neither side gives ground easily, but the Canadians, who Hitler thought would collapse against elite German forces, are holding their own. Hitler's statements about the Canadians during this period, recorded in the diaries and memoirs of those present, show a man struggling to maintain his worldview in the face of contradictory evidence. On June 15th, during a situation conference, Hitler makes a statement that will be repeated in various forms over the coming weeks. The Canadians at Juno Beach did not break through because they are superior soldiers. They broke through because our defenses were betrayed. There must have been intelligence leaks. The Canadians knew exactly where our weak points were. This conspiracy theory, that German defeats are always the result of betrayal rather than enemy capability, is characteristic of Hitler's thinking. It preserves his ideology while explaining away uncomfortable facts. His staff does not openly contradict him, though some of the professional soldiers present no better. The Canadians succeeded at Juno Beach because they trained hard, planned well, and executed aggressively, not because of betrayal, but stating this truth to Hitler is pointless and dangerous. On June 20th, Hitler issues a directive regarding forces facing the Canadians. It is a strange document, reflecting his confused thinking. Forces engaged against Canadian formations will fight with the understanding that the enemy, while aggressive, lacks staying power. The Canadians are capable of short, intense efforts, but cannot sustain prolonged operations. Defensive tactics should focus on absorbing initial assaults and counterattacking once enemy momentum is exhausted. This assessment is completely wrong. The Canadians are proving to have excellent staying power, fighting continuously for 2 weeks without their effectiveness declining. But Hitler needs to believe that Canadian success is temporary, based on factors other than genuine capability. If he admits that the Canadians are simply good soldiers, he would have to admit that his entire racial hierarchy is flawed, and that is psychologically impossible for him. By the end of June, as the Battle of Normandy enters its 4th week, Hitler's comments about the Canadians take on a different tone. He stops questioning how they broke through at Juno Beach. Instead, he begins to focus on conspiracy theories about why Canadian forces specifically were chosen for that sector. The British placed the Canadians at Juno Beach because they knew it was the weakest part of our defenses, he tells Jodl. It was a calculated decision. Put the inferior colonial troops against the inferior German divisions. This statement reveals how Hitler has rationalized the Canadian success. Both sides were inferior in his mind. The Canadians are inferior soldiers who succeeded only because they faced inferior German defenders. It is a way of explaining the outcome without admitting that the Canadians might actually be effective troops. Jodl, a careful man who has learned when to contradict the Führer and when to stay silent, says nothing. By early July, as Canadian forces continue to fight around Caen and the city becomes the focus of intense Allied efforts, Hitler's references to the Canadians become less frequent. He has moved on to other concerns, other fronts, other problems. But the legacy of June 6th remains. The Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach in 37 minutes was not just a tactical success. It was a strategic surprise that caught Hitler and the German High Command completely unprepared. And their response to that surprise, shaped by ideological blindness and racial prejudice, contributed directly to Germany's failure to throw the Allies back into the sea. If Hitler had taken Canadian capabilities seriously, if he had positioned stronger forces at Juno Beach, if he had responded more quickly to the breakthrough, the Battle of Normandy might have developed differently. Not necessarily with a German victory. The Allies had overwhelming advantages in air power, naval power, and logistics. But the failure to contain the Juno beachhead in the first hours and days of the invasion gave the Allies a critical advantage that they never relinquished. In this sense, Hitler's statements about the Canadian breakthrough matter less than his decisions, and his decisions were driven by his statements, by his beliefs, by his ideology. When he said that Canadians were not capable soldiers, he meant it, and that belief led him to make strategic errors that cost Germany dearly. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, the unit that broke through at Juno Beach, went on to fight through the entire Northwest Europe campaign. They fought in the Battle of Normandy, they fought in the Scheldt, they fought in the Rhineland, they fought into Germany itself. And everywhere they fought, German forces learned that the Führer's assessment of Canadian capabilities was dangerously wrong. But Hitler never fully acknowledged this. In his final months, as the Third Reich collapsed around him, Hitler continued to cling to his ideological certainties. When German forces were defeated, it was always because of betrayal, or inadequate resources, or poor leadership, never because the enemy simply fought better. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers examined captured German documents, they found extensive records of Hitler's statements during situation conferences. Among these documents were transcripts and summaries from the conferences following D-Day. One passage from a conference on June 7th, the day after the invasion, captures Hitler's thinking about the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach with particular clarity. Hitler is quoted as saying, "The breach at Juno Beach demonstrates not the strength of the enemy, but the weakness of our coastal defenses. A properly defended position should hold for days against any assault force. That it fell in under an hour proves that the defenders were insufficient or the defenses were inadequate. This is not a reflection of enemy capability. It is a reflection of our failure to properly prepare." This statement is technically correct in noting that German defenses at Juno Beach were not as strong as they should have been. But it completely misses the point that the Canadians demonstrated exceptional assault capabilities. They did everything right. The Germans did many things wrong. Both things are true. But Hitler could only acknowledge one of them. Another document, from a conference in mid-June, records Hitler discussing the allocation of reinforcements to various sectors of the Normandy front. When asked about priorities for the Canadian sector, Hitler reportedly said, "The Canadians are not our primary concern. They lack the industrial base to sustain prolonged offensive operations. Their initial success was impressive, but cannot be maintained. We should focus our reserves against the American and British threats." This assessment proved wrong almost immediately. The Canadians sustained their operations throughout the summer, continuing to fight effectively even as casualties mounted and units became exhausted. But Hitler had convinced himself that Canadian success was temporary, and no amount of evidence could change his mind. A third document, a memorandum from Jodl to field commanders in late June, reflects Hitler's instructions regarding tactics against Canadian forces. The Führer has directed that units facing Canadian formations should employ flexible defense tactics, trading space for time. Canadian forces can be expected to advance rapidly but with extended supply lines. Counterattacks should target these supply lines rather than engaging Canadian infantry directly. This might have been sound tactical advice if applied against any Allied force, but the phrasing reveals Hitler's thinking. He expected Canadian forces to be vulnerable because of logistical weaknesses, a vulnerability that did not actually exist to the degree he assumed. These documents, and dozens of others like them, paint a picture of a leader who could not accurately assess enemy capabilities because his ideology prevented him from seeing clearly. Hitler's comments about the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach, therefore, are not just historical curiosities. They are windows into the strategic decision-making of Nazi Germany at a critical moment. And they show how ideology, when it overrides military reality, leads to defeat. The Canadian soldiers who hit Juno Beach on June 6th were not superhuman. They were ordinary men, farmers and factory workers and students who had been trained to do an extraordinarily difficult job. They did that job well. They broke through the Atlantic Wall not because the defenses were weak, though they were weaker than they should have been. They broke through because they were professional soldiers executing a well-planned assault with skill and courage. Hitler could never acknowledge this because acknowledging it would undermine the entire structure of his beliefs. If Canadians, whom he considered racially and culturally inferior, could perform at this level, then what did that say about German superiority? What did it say about the racial hierarchy that justified Nazi ideology? These questions were too dangerous to contemplate, and so Hitler explained away the Canadian breakthrough with conspiracy theories, with blame directed at German commanders, with anything except the simple truth. The truth was that the Canadian Army in 1944 was a formidable fighting force, well-trained, well-equipped, well-led, and highly motivated. The truth was that Canadian soldiers, on average, were as good as or better than German soldiers at the tactical level. And the truth was that Hitler's racial ideology had blinded him to this reality, causing him to make strategic errors that contributed to Germany's defeat in Normandy and ultimately in the war. When Hitler learned that Canada broke through Normandy in 37 minutes, he said many things. He said the reports were wrong. He said the defenders had failed. He said there must have been betrayal. He said the Canadians were stiffened by British leadership. He said everything except the simple truth, that the Canadians had trained for this moment, that they had planned meticulously, that they had executed aggressively, and that they had succeeded because they were good at what they did. This inability to see reality, this determination to interpret every event through the lens of a flawed ideology, is what ultimately doomed Hitler and the regime he led. Not just at Juno Beach, though, that was a vivid example, but throughout the war, on every front, in every decision where ideology trumped military logic. The Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach mattered tactically because it established a secure beachhead that became the foundation for the liberation of Northwest Europe. But it also mattered strategically because Hitler's response to it, his inability to accurately assess what had happened and why, led him to make errors that he repeated again and again throughout the Normandy campaign. He underestimated Allied capabilities. He overestimated German strengths. He made decisions based on what he wanted to believe, rather than what was actually true. And the consequences of those decisions were written in the blood of German soldiers who were sent to fight battles they could not win, based on assumptions that were not accurate. The soldiers of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division who broke through at Juno Beach did not know that their success was causing this kind of cognitive dissonance at the highest levels of German command. They were too busy fighting and dying to worry about what Hitler thought. But in a sense, their achievement was even greater than they realized. They did not just breach the Atlantic Wall, they breached Hitler's certainty. They introduced doubt into a system that could not tolerate doubt, and that psychological crack, small as it was, contributed to the collapse of the entire structure. Because when you build everything on ideology rather than reality, reality always wins in the end. It just takes time. And at Juno Beach, on June 6, 1944, reality came ashore with a maple leaf on its shoulder. It broke through the Atlantic Wall in 37 minutes, and it began the process, slow and bloody but inevitable, of bringing down the 1,000-year Reich that its deluded leader had promised would last forever. Hitler said many things about the Canadian breakthrough, but the one thing he never said, the one thing he could never say, was the simple truth. They were better than we expected. And that failure to acknowledge truth, more than any single battle or campaign, explains why Hitler lost the war.